Today we are finally going to look at some homebrew options for you to use to include firearms in your D&D 5th edition campaign. Welcome back, guys. My name is Sebastian. This is Sebastian's Cauldron. This is episode 3, part 3, whatever you want to call it, of my Firearms and Fantasy series, where we are looking at including firearms in your fantasy game. As I said, this part, we are going to be looking at some homebrew options for you to add firearms, gunpowder, explosives, and everything into your D&D 5e game. If you've watched the previous 2 parts of this series, you'll know that we've talked about in the first one, which I'll put a link up there, we talked about some setting-specific things that you should think about before including them. What type of guns you want, what kind of flavor, tone, etc. All of that important stuff for your setting, for your world building. In the second part, we talked about a couple of different games that all included firearms in their base options or in some sort of expansion. As I always say, this is a D&D channel, so we are going to talk about D&D, specifically 5th edition, the most popular version at the moment. Is that a hot take? I don't think it is. It's very popular nowadays. I'm going to put some timestamps probably here. If you want to look at, there's 3 different homebrews we're looking at. We're looking at Matt Mercer's Gunslinger because, of course, we're looking at the Gunpowder Codex, and we are looking at the Mage Hand Press's Weird West update. Firstly, let's do a quick review of the options that we already have access to just from the base rules of D&D 5th edition. We have 2 options. We can do the quick and dirty easy method of just reflavoring crossbows as firearms. That works pretty well. That doesn't take too much effort, really. It does sort of make you very limited in that you only have 2 options, a light or a heavy crossbow, so I guess it would be a one-handed weapon or a 2-handed weapon, but it's a pretty simple way of doing things. You don't really need to do any extra work. The other option is to use the firearms that are included in the Dungeon Master's Guide. There are optional rules included for Renaissance firearms, more advanced firearms, and even things like energy pistols and antimatter rifles if you want to go over to that side of things. While these options are both pretty simple, don't take a lot of work for you as a DM to include, they are obviously quite simple, quite minimal, and it might be unsatisfying both for you and for your players if firearms don't feel different. Firearms are meant to be completely different, a whole new level of combat, of fighting, so it would be nice to have firearms that really feel different to the current options that you have. So we are going to look at these 3 homebrew options. First up, Matt Mercer's Gunslinger subclass. This subclass is perhaps the most popular option for people thinking about including a gunslinger or firearms in their D&D game. And of course it is. Matt Mercer is the DM for Critical Role, extremely popular, everybody knows him. And Critical Role's first campaign soared into popularity, the Gunslinger, thanks to Taliesin Jaffe's character, Percival Frankenstein von Musa-Kowalski de Rollo III. As many of you would know, some of you don't, which is also cool, Critical Role was initially a Pathfinder game, which then transitioned to D&D 5e, I think for the stream, which meant that they had to translate a lot of the character classes and concepts from Pathfinder into 5th edition D&D. Pathfinder, as I mentioned in the second part of this series, includes gunslingers and firearms in its expansion book Ultimate Combat. So this subclass was an attempt to translate those mechanics into 5th edition D&D. This subclass is freely available on the DM's Guild. You can also get it on D&D Beyond as well if you include Critical Role content. It's probably also on Roll20, Foundry, other virtual tabletop options that you have, etc. So this subclass is for the fighter main class, and it really nails down on the striking capabilities of the fighter, doing lots and lots of damage. The subclass itself focuses on 2 main aspects of a gunslinger: the gunsmithing and trick shots. The gunsmithing sort of puts you into a role where you are going to be actively crafting your weapons, so this is a really great subclass if you are looking at an emerging guns campaign or a very rare guns campaign. And then the trick shots are very similar to the Battlemaster's fighting maneuvers, sort of little combat tricks that help augment your attacks and do some extra special, extra cool things. Mercer's subclass includes Firearm rules, obviously. These bring over the reload and misfire scores from Pathfinder. The misfire score acting as a sort of punishment or as a risk for this very high risk, high reward sort of playstyle. It includes a few different firearms ranging from a simple pistol to the pepper box to a blunderbuss to bad news, which I think is like some big BFG style like sniper rifle, crazy high-powered damage thing. Awesome. The subclass itself in terms of balance is sort of interesting. It's gone through a few revisions and gotten a bit better over time. You are sort of thrown into a trap that many people will sort of notice when doing things like critical failures on a natural one, etc., in which as a fighter you're going to be doing a lot of attacks. That means more dice rolling, which means you are more likely to roll more natural ones or twos, depending on what your misfire score is for your firearm, which means you're sort of going to be punished in a way for this style of play. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That high risk, high reward play can be really fun to some people. To others, that might get a little annoying. It might feel like you're being punished for choosing a particular way of playing rather than playing in some other way. There are rules for clearing your misfires, which makes it fairly simple to do, but it is going to soak up a bit of your action economy, taking a full action for you to repair it until you get to, I think it's level 10 or so, where you can repair a misfired weapon as a bonus action. Cool. 10 or 15, one of the two. One of them is bonus action to reload, one's bonus action to repair. I'll put text that'll say which one it is. But this is a fantastic option for a DM to quickly add a gunslinger, add some firearms to their campaign. A lot of people, like I said, are going to be familiar with Critical Role, so they'll already know that this is a thing. If you don't, again, that's totally cool, but it's a really interesting subclass that brings some nice flavor, some nice mechanics that really makes the gunslinger feel like its own sort of thing, which is exactly what you want. The next one we're going to talk about is the Gunpowder Codex, which has a really, really cool cover. It's like a pirate dude. It's got a bunch of flintlocks on it and everything. It's awesome. This is the homebrew that I am currently using for my campaign, which is sort of on hiatus at the moment. We haven't played in a little bit, but that's probably a topic for a different video. This is a massive, massive codex, which includes everything from full firearm rules to full crafting rules, subclasses for every class, some magic items and everything. Awesome. Looking through the document, we get a bit of discussion first on including firearms in fantasy, which is super cool, talking about guns and genre, scarcity, technology, etc. It then includes a massive array of new firearms and new properties, including the misfire score, the reload score, the scatter property for sort of weapons like shotguns and whatnot. These are slightly different to Mercer's, with the misfire property being a little less punishing, but still gives you that sort of, it's going to be a bit of a risk using the firearms, which is totally fine. There should be a bit of risk involved, if anything. Reload is changed so that it is by default an action or a bonus action rather than a full action or an attack, I think, for Mercer's Gunslinger, which is an interesting choice, but sure, why not? The weapons themselves are broken up into martial firearms and advanced firearms. The martial firearms, you are going to see flintlock weapons, flintlock pistols, muskets, arquebus, all of those, whereas the advanced firearms get obviously a little more advanced. Pistols, revolvers, sniper rifle revolvers, hunting rifles, Gatling guns, all of those really interesting, slightly more modern weapons. There is a massive list of each weapon, a description of it, and typically a picture next to it, so you don't have to do any extra research. You can look at it and see exactly what it looks like, how it would be used, all of that important stuff. There's some magic weapons that are included as well, legendary revolvers and artifact weapons that you can include or not include, and there is a very detailed crafting system for these weapons. So similar to Matt Mercer's Gunslinger, it presumes that your character is going to be a gunsmith in addition to a gunslinger, which is cool if that's the style of play you're going for. Awesome. I am sure that you don't need to include that, but my god, the crafting rules are stupidly intricate. I think it's really interesting. I haven't used them to their full extent. I've sort of simplified them a little bit for my own sake, but they seem to have done a pretty good job of balancing the rules. For example, the revolver that is included does 2d8 damage, which is incredibly high, but it is sort of kept by the crafting rules, which requires you to pass 4 DC 30 Tinker's Tools checks, which I'm pretty sure are meant to be intelligence-based for this check, which is crazy high. You're not going to be making something like that for a very long time, which is totally fine. Endgame, you can start getting a little crazier in terms of damage and all of that stuff. As I said, there are also subclasses for every class. There's the Fire Dancer for the Monk, the Pistolero for the Bard, or the Powder Blood for the Sorcerer, which are all super cool options. I've used a couple of these in one-shots and everything, and people have seemed to enjoy them. There's also new spells for some of these spellcasting subclasses that get included. So like I said, there is a lot in here. This is a really great document, a really great homebrew for doing a sort of multi-genre sort of thing. You can do a Western sort of campaign really easily. You can do flintlocks. You can go a little more modern with the sort of pistols and shotguns and Gatling guns, although you are going to struggle to find a well-balanced sort of automatic rifle. I think there's one included in the Dungeon Master's Guide. You could potentially use that. The third and final one we are going to look at is the Weird West update. This has been published by Mage Hand Press. Unlike the other two options, this one is not free. It will run you $5. I'm pretty sure that's American Yankee dollars that you gotta pay, but it's a pretty extensive homebrew as well. This one is focusing, like the title says, on Weird West. This is not quite Western fantasy, or I guess fantasy Western, it's one of the two. Weird West is sort of an interesting, typically alternate history sort of thing that includes supernatural elements. We see this in Red Dead Redemption's Undead Nightmare expansion, in which there are zombies and all sorts of generally spooky things. You could make an argument that Fallout New Vegas itself is a Weird West. It's typically defined by supernatural or preternatural elements, potentially a bit of science fiction, some fantasy. Fantasy is usually just anything that's like our world, but not quite there. So this is technically fantasy. As I said, this homebrew is extensive. We get a full Gunslinger class, very similar to Mercer's, but different in a few key ways. You get similar trick shots, which are called risks, fueled by your risk dice. And there are also several subclasses for each main class, most classes getting 1 or 2 new subclasses, which really gives you a lot of brand new options. Now, obviously, with a name like Weird West, you are going to find, flicking through this homebrew, that this is mainly focused on a Western specific setting. So if you're looking to do flintlock fantasy or something a little more modern, you might want to give this one a skip, because this is fully baked in the Western flavor. We're talking revolvers, sticks of dynamite, lever action rifles, double-barreled shotguns, and the occasional Gatling gun that is being drawn by a carriage. The weapons themselves, I think, have a pretty clear influence from Pathfinder's Firearms. The first major thing being you do not add your ability modifier to your damage rolls, which is a bit of a nerf. If you had a +5 to dex and you were using a 2d4 revolver, your average damage is going to go down significantly purely because you are not adding 5 to every single attack. Albeit there are some class features, some subclasses, etc. that give you the ability to add your ability modifier to the damage rolls, but that is, again, later in the game, later in levels. I think the Gunslinger gets it around level 10 or 11. Furthermore, there are some additional weapon properties such as foregrip and sighted, which gives you some sort of more mechanical flavor for these different weapons, so that a sniper rifle is going to feel significantly different to a small revolver. So this homebrew looks to be the most intricate, the most detailed. It is also the newest one that I have personally found, and I have not been able to use it yet, so I could not tell you if it's broken or if it works well. just reading through it, it looks fine. I don't see anything that's, crying out to me as immediately broken yet. I'm planning on doing a Western game at some point because I love Westerns, so I'll probably use it then and be able to report back on whether or not it's good or not. However, it does look fairly extensive, it's got a lot of stuff, and of course, like with anything, with any D&D homebrew or just the rules in general, you as a DM are free to change things, to homebrew your own stuff, and do whatever you want. At the end of the day, it is your game. So those are 3 homebrew options that you can potentially use for including firearms. Let me know if you're using one or some or all of them. Maybe don't use all of them, that might have some conflicts, but I think these are the 3 best options for firearms, for gunslingers, and all that sort of stuff for D&D 5th edition. If you know of or use other homebrew that you think is better, that you think is interesting, that has something different, leave a comment down below, let me know what it is. I would love to see it. Some of you may have noticed watching the video that my bookshelf looks a little different, and that is because I have moved my sci-fi and fantasy sections down a little bit so that I can actually reach them. I don't have to jump up onto a chair to grab a book. I don't know, it's February, I'm kind of bored at the moment waiting for uni to start back again, so I thought, let's do some rearranging. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you liked the video, you can do all the usual stuff. There'll be some cards that you can click on. My Iron Man video is really popular at the moment. You can also check out my Lost Minds and Fandelver series, and I'll see you guys some other time.